Thomas McAllister stood on his front porch, watching the dust cloud grow larger on the horizon. His weathered hands gripped the wooden railing as he squinted against the afternoon sun beating down on his ranch in the Wyoming Territory. The stagecoach was right on time, carrying the woman who would soon become his wife. He ran a rough palm across his stubbled jaw, feeling every one of his 38 years. It had been 3 years since Mary's passing, 3 long years of trying to manage both the ranch and raise their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, on his own. The loneliness had carved itself deep into his bones, but it was the practical concerns that finally drove him to place that advertisement in the Eastern newspapers. Seeking sensible woman for marriage, must be hardworking, good with children, and comfortable with ranch life. Write to Thomas McAllister, Sweetwater Creek, Wyoming Territory. He'd been very specific about what he wanted. No romantic nonsense, no delicate flowers who would wilt under the harsh prairie sun. Just a practical arrangement between 2 adults who understood the realities of frontier life. The woman he'd been corresponding with, Miss Catherine Walsh from Philadelphia, had seemed perfect. Her letters were neat, brief, and businesslike. She'd worked as a governess, understood children, and claimed to be prepared for the challenges of ranch life. Thomas heard the screen door creak behind him and turned to see Emma peering out, her dark hair braided with the careful precision only a child could manage when trying to look grown up. "Is that her, Papa?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Looks to be," Thomas replied, reaching out to squeeze his daughter's shoulder. Emma had been excited about getting a new mama, though Thomas had been careful to explain that this was different from before. This was a practical arrangement, not a love match like he'd had with her mother. The stagecoach pulled up in front of the house with a jangle of harnesses and a cloud of prairie dust. The driver, old Pete Morrison, climbed down from his seat and opened the door. Thomas watched as a small gloved hand appeared, followed by a woman in a dark traveling dress. Thomas blinked hard, certain the sun was playing tricks on his eyes. The woman stepping down from the stagecoach was nothing like what he'd expected. Where he'd pictured a stern, practical woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, he instead saw someone who couldn't be much past 25, with auburn hair catching the sunlight and the kind of face that belonged in a painting, not on a Wyoming ranch. Catherine Walsh looked around with wide green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The vast expanse of prairie stretching in all directions, the wooden ranch house with its wide porch, the corrals and outbuildings, and finally, the man and child watching her from the porch. Thomas found himself frozen in place. This couldn't be the sensible, practical woman he'd been expecting. This was a lady, clearly educated and refined, who looked like she'd never done a day of hard work in her life. What was someone like her doing answering his advertisement? Catherine approached the porch with careful steps, her traveling bag clutched in both hands. She looked up at Thomas with an expression that seemed equal parts determined and terrified. "Mr. McAllister," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I'm Catherine Walsh. I believe you're expecting me." Thomas descended the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. Up close, he could see that her hands were indeed soft and unmarked by calluses. Her dress was made of fine fabric, and everything about her spoke of a life far removed from ranch work. "Miss Walsh," he said, tipping his hat, "welcome to Sweetwater Creek." An awkward silence stretched between them, while Emma remained safely behind her father. Catherine looked from Thomas to the little girl and back again, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult," Thomas finally managed. "Not at all," Catherine replied quickly. "Though I must admit, the landscape is quite different from what I'm accustomed to." Thomas almost smiled at the understatement. The endless prairie, with its rolling hills and distant mountains, bore no resemblance to Philadelphia's busy streets and manicured parks. "Emma," Thomas said, turning slightly toward his daughter, Come say hello to Miss Walsh. Emma stepped forward shyly, offering a small curtsy. Hello, Miss Walsh. Papa says you're going to be my new mama. Catherine's face softened as she looked at the little girl. She knelt down so she was at Emma's eye level, her fine dress touching the dusty ground without regard for the fabric. Hello, Emma, she said gently. What a lovely curtsy. Did you learn that all by yourself? Emma nodded proudly. Mama taught me before she went to heaven. Thomas saw something flicker across Catherine's face, sadness, understanding, and something else he couldn't quite identify. She reached out and gently touched Emma's hand. She must have been a wonderful teacher. Would you like to show me around your home? Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her in weeks. She grabbed Catherine's hand and began pulling her toward the house, chattering about her room and her dollhouse and the new kittens in the barn. Thomas followed behind, carrying Catherine's traveling bag and trying to process what was happening. This wasn't going at all the way he'd planned. He'd expected a straightforward business arrangement with a practical woman who would keep house, help with Emma, and perhaps provide some companionship during the long winter months. Instead, he found himself dealing with someone who seemed to genuinely care about his daughter after knowing her for 5 minutes. Inside the house, Catherine's eyes moved carefully over the simple but comfortable furnishings. Thomas saw his home through her eyes, the rough-hewn wooden floors, the basic furniture he'd built himself, the simple curtains Mary had sewn years ago and that he'd never had the heart to replace. It's quite cozy, Catherine said, and Thomas found himself listening for any hint of disappointment in her voice. If there was any, she hid it well. Emma continued her tour, showing Catherine the kitchen with its big iron stove, the sitting room with its stone fireplace, and finally her own small bedroom with its collection of dolls and books. Do you read, Miss Walsh? Emma asked, holding up one of her favorite storybooks. I do indeed, Catherine replied, settling herself on Emma's bed. In fact, I used to read to children as part of my work back in Philadelphia. Would you like me to read to you sometime? Emma nodded enthusiastically, and Thomas found himself struck by how natural Catherine seemed with his daughter. Despite her refined appearance, she didn't talk down to Emma or seem uncomfortable with a child's enthusiasm. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to see glimpses of the woman behind the ladylike exterior. When Emma spilled jam on her dress at dinner, Catherine didn't fuss or worry about the stain. She simply laughed and said it gave the dress character. When a sudden prairie wind blew the kitchen door open, rattling dishes and scattering papers, Catherine quickly helped gather everything up without being asked. After Emma went to bed, Thomas and Catherine sat on the front porch, the evening air cooling around them. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but weighted with unspoken questions. I have to ask, Thomas said finally, what brought you out here? Your letters suggested someone more practical. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded carefully in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. I suppose I wasn't entirely honest in my correspondence, she said. The truth is, I needed to leave Philadelphia. My circumstances there became difficult. Thomas waited, sensing there was more to the story. I was engaged to a man my family approved of, Catherine continued, a businessman with good prospects and social standing. But as our wedding approached, I discovered some things about his character that I couldn't overlook. When I broke the engagement, it created quite a scandal. My reputation was ruined, and my family disowned me. She turned to look at Thomas, her green eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. I know this probably isn't what you were expecting. I know I'm not the practical, sensible woman you advertised for. But I want you to know that I'm prepared to work hard and learn whatever I need to learn. I can cook basic meals, I can clean house, and I genuinely care about Emma's welfare. Thomas studied her face in the gathering dusk. There was something honest and determined in her expression that he hadn't expected. Despite her refined appearance, there was steel beneath the surface. "Can you handle ranch life?" he asked bluntly. "The work is hard, the weather is harsh, and there are no social gatherings or fancy shops for miles around." "I can handle whatever needs to be done," Catherine replied firmly. "I didn't come out here looking for an easy life, Mr. McAllister. I came looking for a fresh start and the chance to build something meaningful." Thomas found himself nodding slowly. Maybe she wasn't what he'd expected, but there was something about her that suggested she was stronger than she appeared. "We should discuss the practical arrangements," he said. "The preacher comes through town once a month. He'll be back next week, and we can have the ceremony then if you're agreeable." Catherine nodded. "That would be fine. Until then, you can stay in the guest room. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch will come by tomorrow to help you get settled and show you around the property." They sat in comfortable quiet for a while longer, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through the grass, the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the darkness. "Thank you," Catherine said finally. "For what?" "For giving me this chance, even though I'm not what you expected." Thomas looked at her profile in the moonlight. "We'll see how it works out. Ranch life has a way of testing people." The next morning brought Thomas his first real glimpse of who Catherine Walsh truly was beneath her ladylike exterior. He woke to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen and the smell of coffee brewing. When he came downstairs, he found Catherine already dressed and standing at the stove, attempting to flip what appeared to be pancakes. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, though Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. "I thought I'd try to make breakfast." Emma appeared at the kitchen doorway, drawn by the unusual activity. "Miss Walsh is cooking, Papa." Thomas approached the stove and peered at Catherine's efforts. The pancakes were decidedly lopsided and varied wildly in size, but they smelled edible. "First time making pancakes?" he asked. Catherine's cheeks colored slightly. "Is it that obvious? I'm afraid my cooking experience is rather limited, but I'm determined to learn." Thomas found himself unexpectedly charmed by her determination. Most ladies of her apparent background would have expected to be waited on, not to be up before dawn trying to master unfamiliar tasks. After breakfast, Mrs. Henderson arrived as promised. Sarah Henderson was a practical woman in her 50s who had been ranching with her husband for over 20 years. She took one look at Catherine's fine dress and soft hands and shook her head. "First thing we need to do is get you some proper clothes," Sarah announced. "That fancy dress won't last a week out here." Catherine nodded eagerly. "I was hoping you might help me with that. I brought some money and I'm willing to learn whatever I need to learn." Sarah's expression softened slightly at Catherine's earnestness. "Well, at least you've got the right attitude. Come on, let's see what we can do about getting you outfitted properly." Thomas watched from the porch as Sarah led Catherine around the property, pointing out various buildings and explaining their purposes. Catherine listened intently, asking questions and taking mental notes. When they reached the chicken coop, Thomas saw Catherine hesitate only briefly before following Sarah inside, emerging a few minutes later with egg stains on her skirt and a triumphant smile on her face. By midday, Sarah had taken Catherine into town to purchase more practical clothing and supplies. They returned with packages wrapped in brown paper, and Catherine wearing a simple calico dress that, while still flattering, was clearly designed for work rather than show. "How did she do?" Thomas asked Sarah privately, while Catherine was upstairs changing into her new clothes. "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. "She's soft, no doubt about it, but she's got grit underneath. She didn't complain once, even when that rooster came after her in the chicken coop. Most Eastern ladies would have run screaming." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. It seemed Catherine Walsh was full of surprises. Over the next several days, Thomas found himself observing Catherine with growing curiosity. She attacked each new task with determination that bordered on stubbornness. When she burned the first batch of biscuits, she immediately started on another batch. When the cow kicked over the milk pail during her first attempt at milking, she calmly cleaned up the mess and tried again. Her relationship with Emma blossomed naturally. Catherine never tried to replace Mary in Emma's memory, but instead carved out her own place in the little girl's heart. She taught Emma new songs, helped her with her letters, and listened to her chatter about everything from wildflowers to the habits of prairie dogs. Thomas began to notice other things, too. The way Catherine's face lit up when she successfully completed a task she'd been struggling with, how she hummed while she worked, filling the house with music for the first time since Mary's death. The genuine interest she showed in learning about ranch life, asking questions about cattle and horses and weather patterns. Most surprising of all was how her presence seemed to brighten the entire atmosphere of the ranch. Workers who had been quietly respectful around Thomas found themselves smiling and joking when Catherine was nearby. Even the animals seemed to respond to her gentle manner. One evening, as they sat on the porch after another day of Catherine's determined efforts to master ranch life, Thomas found himself asking a question he hadn't planned to voice. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Catherine looked at him with surprise. "Regret it? Why would I regret it?" "This isn't the life you were raised for," Thomas said. "You could have found another situation back east. Maybe found another man to marry." Catherine was quiet for a moment, looking out at the vast prairie stretching endlessly in all directions. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "I spent my whole life trying to be what other people expected me to be," she said. "The perfect daughter, the perfect fiancée, the perfect lady. But I was never really happy. Out here, for the first time in my life, I feel like I can be myself." Thomas studied her profile in the lamplight spilling from the house windows. "And who is that?" Catherine smiled, and Thomas noticed how it transformed her entire face. "I'm still finding out." The day before the preacher was scheduled to arrive, Catherine made her most ambitious attempt yet at conquering ranch life. She announced at breakfast that she intended to help with the cattle roundup that Thomas and his men were conducting in the north pasture. "Catherine," Thomas said carefully, "cattle work is dangerous. These aren't gentle dairy cows. They're half-wild range cattle." "I understand that," Catherine replied firmly. "But if I'm going to be a rancher's wife, I need to understand all aspects of ranch operation." Thomas looked at her determined expression and realized there would be no talking her out of it. "You'll ride with me and do exactly what I tell you to do." Catherine nodded eagerly. And Thomas found himself both admiring her courage and worrying about her safety. The roundup proved to be an education for both of them. Catherine's horsemanship, while adequate for gentle rides around Philadelphia parks, was severely tested by the requirements of cattle work. But she stuck with it, following Thomas's instructions and gradually gaining confidence in the saddle. When a young steer broke away from the herd and headed for rough country, Catherine surprised everyone by successfully turning it back toward the group. The ranch hands cheered, and Thomas found himself grinning at her look of pure joy and accomplishment. That evening, as they prepared for the wedding ceremony that would take place the next day, Thomas realized something had shifted in his thinking about Catherine Walsh. She was still not the practical, sensible woman he had advertised for, but she had proven to be something perhaps more valuable, a partner who brought light and determination to his life and genuine happiness to his daughter. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the prairie wind whistling around the house, Thomas found himself looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't expected when this whole arrangement began. Whatever challenges lay ahead, He had the feeling that Catherine Walsh would meet them with the same determined brightness that had already begun to transform his quiet ranch into something that felt remarkably like a real home again. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. Catherine stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the simple blue dress she had chosen for the ceremony. It wasn't the elaborate gown she had once planned to wear for her wedding in Philadelphia, but somehow it felt more appropriate for the life she was choosing now. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Emma peered around the door, her face bright with excitement. "Miss Catherine, Papa sent me to ask if you're ready. The preacher's here, and Mrs. Henderson brought flowers from her garden." Catherine smiled at the little girl who would soon officially become her stepdaughter. "I'm ready, Emma. How do I look?" Emma's eyes went wide. "You look beautiful, like a real bride." Catherine felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. In less than an hour, she would be Mrs. Thomas McAllister, bound to this ranch and this family by law and commitment. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The ceremony itself was simple and brief, held in the front parlor with Sarah Henderson and her husband as witnesses. Preacher Morrison spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of commitment, his words carrying extra weight in the harsh frontier environment where partnerships truly meant survival. When Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto Catherine's finger, she looked up into his weathered face and saw something she hadn't expected: genuine warmth and respect. This might have started as a practical arrangement, but there was the foundation for something deeper. "You may kiss the bride," Preacher Morrison announced with a slight smile. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, then leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Catherine's lips. It was brief and chaste. But Catherine felt a warm flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with nerves. Emma clapped her hands with delight, and the small gathering broke into smiles and congratulations. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a simple wedding cake, and they shared it on the front porch with coffee and conversation about the upcoming winter preparations. As the sun began to set and their guests departed, Catherine found herself alone with Thomas and Emma for the first time as a married woman. The reality of her new situation settled over her like a comfortable blanket. She belonged here now, for better or worse. The first few weeks of married life established a pleasant rhythm. Catherine threw herself into learning every aspect of ranch management, from preserving vegetables for winter to understanding the subtleties of cattle behavior. Thomas proved to be a patient teacher, answering her endless questions with good humor and gradually including her in more complex decisions about ranch operations. Emma blossomed under Catherine's attention. The little girl had been somewhat withdrawn since her mother's death, but Catherine's gentle encouragement and genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings helped her open up again. They spent hours together reading, working on arithmetic, and exploring the prairie around the ranch house. Catherine also discovered that she had a natural talent for some aspects of ranch life that surprised everyone, including herself. Her small hands proved perfect for milking the more temperamental cows, and her gentle manner with the horses made even the most skittish animals calm. She developed a particular fondness for a mare named Daisy, who had been considered too nervous for regular riding, but responded beautifully to Catherine's patient approach. But it was her impact on the ranch's social dynamics that proved most significant. Word of Thomas's new wife spread quickly through the scattered ranching community, and Catherine found herself at the center of a social network she hadn't expected to exist in such a remote area. The first visitor was Martha Stevens, wife of the rancher whose property bordered theirs to the east. Martha arrived one Thursday morning with her 2 young children and a basket of fresh bread, ostensibly to welcome the new bride, but obviously burning with curiosity about the Eastern lady who had married Thomas McAllister. Catherine welcomed them warmly, serving coffee and asking Martha about her children and ranch life. By the time Martha left 3 hours later, she was singing Catherine's praises to anyone who would listen. Soon, Catherine found herself hosting informal gatherings of ranch women who came to share news, trade recipes, and discuss everything from childcare to cattle prices. These women, who had seemed so formidably self-sufficient from a distance, proved to be eager for the kind of social connection that Catherine instinctively provided. Thomas watched these developments with amazement. The isolated ranch that had seemed so quiet since Mary's death was now filled with laughter and conversation. Catherine had somehow created a social hub that drew people from miles around, bringing a sense of community to their remote corner of Wyoming territory. "I never expected this," he told Catherine one evening as they watched Emma playing with the Stevens children in the yard while their mothers finished cleaning up after another successful gathering. "Expected what?" Catherine asked, settling beside him on the porch steps. "The way you've brought everyone together? Mary was well-liked, but she was quiet, more reserved. You've created something different here." Catherine considered his words carefully. "I suppose I've always been the type of person who draws people together. My mother used to say it was because I'm genuinely interested in other people's stories." Thomas nodded, understanding now why Catherine had seemed so out of place in the rigid social structure of Philadelphia society. Her natural warmth and curiosity would have been constrained by formal rules and expectations. Out here, where genuine human connection was precious, her gifts could flourish. As autumn approached, Catherine faced her first major test as a ranch wife. An early blizzard struck in late October, trapping them in the house for 3 days with temperatures dropping far below anything she had ever experienced. The storm began on a Tuesday afternoon with deceptively light snowflakes that quickly intensified into a howling wind that rattled the windows and piled snow against the doors. Thomas and his men had to fight their way through the mounting drifts to secure the animals and ensure adequate feed and water were accessible. Catherine found herself responsible for keeping the household running under conditions she had never imagined. The kitchen stove became the heart of their survival, requiring constant attention to maintain adequate heat throughout the house. She learned to bank the fire properly, to stretch their food supplies, and to keep Emma entertained and calm during the long, dark hours when the wind screamed around the house like a living thing. On the second day of the storm, when Thomas came in from checking the animals with his face red and raw from the cold, Catherine had hot coffee ready and a warm meal that she had somehow managed to prepare despite the challenges. She helped him out of his frozen coat and boots without fuss, then sat with him while he warmed up, listening to his concerns about the cattle and offering practical suggestions for managing their resources. "You're handling this better than I expected," Thomas said, wrapping his hands around the hot coffee mug. "It's certainly different from Philadelphia winters," Catherine replied with a small laugh. "But there's something satisfying about knowing we can take care of ourselves even in conditions like this." Emma, who had been quietly drawing at the kitchen table, looked up at them. "Mama Catherine, will the animals be okay?" Catherine felt a warm flutter at being called Mama Catherine for the first time, but she kept her voice calm and reassuring. "Your papa knows how to take care of them, sweetheart. They have shelter and food, and the storm will pass soon." When the blizzard finally moved on, leaving them surrounded by pristine white drifts that sparkled in the returning sunshine, Catherine felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond anything she had experienced in her previous life. She had not just survived her first major prairie storm, she had helped her family thrive through it. The real test, however, came in November when a crisis struck that would define Catherine's place in the community forever. Word came on a cold morning that the Garrett family, who lived about 10 miles south, were in desperate trouble. Jim Garrett had been injured in an accident with a horse, leaving him unable to work just as winter was settling in. His wife, Ellen, was expecting their 4th child any day, and was struggling to manage their 3 young children while caring for her injured husband. When Martha Stevens brought the news to Catherine during one of their regular coffee visits, Catherine's response was immediate. "We have to help them," she said, without hesitation. Martha nodded. "Several of us have been discussing what can be done. The men can help with their cattle and ranch work, but Ellen needs help with the children and household management, especially with the baby coming." Catherine was already mentally organizing a plan. "I can stay with them. Emma can come with me. She's good with little ones, and it will be educational for her to help." Martha looked surprised. "Catherine, that's a big commitment. It could be weeks, and the conditions there won't be comfortable. Ellen's been struggling to keep up with basic housekeeping, and with Jim laid up. All the more reason she needs help," Catherine replied firmly. "What would any of us want if we were in her situation?" Thomas, when Catherine presented the plan to him that evening, was initially resistant to the idea. "It's too dangerous," he said. "The weather's unpredictable, their ranch is isolated, and you don't know what you might be walking into." Catherine looked at him steadily. "Thomas, Ellen Garrett is facing the birth of a 4th child with an injured husband, 3 little ones to care for, and winter coming on. If I were in her situation, what would you want our neighbors to do?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "When do you want to leave?" 2 days later, Catherine and Emma set out for the Garrett Ranch in the wagon, loaded with supplies and provisions. Catherine had spent the intervening time organizing contributions from the other ranch families: food, warm blankets, medicine, and practical items that would be needed for a household in crisis. What they found at the Garrett place was worse than Catherine had expected. Ellen was clearly exhausted and near the end of her pregnancy, struggling to care for her 3 children aged 2, 4, and 6, while tending to her husband, who was bedridden with a badly injured leg. The house showed signs of weeks of neglect, unwashed dishes, unswept floors, and the general chaos that comes when one person is trying to do the work of several. Catherine took one look at the situation and immediately began organizing. She sent Emma to entertain the children, while she assessed what needed to be done most urgently. Within hours, she had food cooking, laundry soaking, and a plan for managing the household that would allow Ellen to rest and recover. Ellen Garrett, a woman Catherine had met only briefly at community gatherings, broke down in tears when she realized the scope of help that Catherine was offering. "I can't ask you to do this," Ellen said through her tears. "You barely know us, and this isn't your responsibility." Catherine took the exhausted woman's hands in hers. "Ellen, we're neighbors. Out here, that means we take care of each other. You would do the same for me." Over the next 3 weeks, Catherine managed the Garrett household with quiet efficiency. She cared for the children, cooked meals, cleaned house, and even helped with some of the outside chores when Jim's injury prevented him from doing them. When Ellen went into labor, Catherine assisted with the birth, helping to deliver a healthy baby girl while maintaining calm control of a potentially dangerous situation. Emma proved to be an invaluable helper, entertaining the younger children and assisting with household tasks in ways that showed remarkable maturity for her age. The experience of helping another family in crisis seemed to bring out the best in the little girl, and Catherine felt proud of the compassion and competence Emma displayed. Word of Catherine's dedication spread throughout the ranching community. Here was the Eastern lady who some had initially viewed with skepticism, proving that she understood the fundamental values of frontier life: mutual assistance, hard work, and commitment to community welfare. When Thomas came to check on them after the first week, he found a transformed household. The children were clean and happy. Ellen was resting comfortably with her new baby. Jim's injury was healing well under Catherine's careful attention. And the entire place showed signs of organized, caring management. "How is she doing?" Jim asked Thomas privately when Catherine was out of earshot. Better than I could have hoped, Thomas replied honestly. She's proven herself to be exactly the kind of partner this community needs. By the time Catherine and Emma returned home in early December, Catherine had established herself as someone the entire community could depend on. The practical, sensible woman Thomas had originally wanted had been replaced by something better. A woman who brought not just competence but genuine caring and community spirit to everything she touched. The evening of their return, as they sat by the fire with Emma already asleep in her bed, Thomas looked at his wife with new eyes. "What you did for the Garretts," he began. "That went far beyond what anyone expected." Catherine smiled tiredly. "It was what needed to be done. Besides, I learned as much as I helped. Ellen taught me about managing a household under difficult conditions, and the children taught Emma and me both about resilience." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "You've become part of this community in a way I never expected when I first wrote that advertisement." Catherine squeezed his hand gently. "I found something here I never had back east, a place where I can truly be useful, where what I do matters to people I care about." As winter settled over the ranch in earnest, Catherine had proven herself not just as a capable ranch wife, but as a woman who could bring light and hope to even the most challenging situations. The practical arrangement Thomas had sought had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, a true partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and growing affection. But their greatest test still lay ahead, in the form of a crisis that would threaten everything they had built together and force them both to confront the true depth of their commitment to each other and their new life. February arrived with a deceptive warmth that fooled everyone into thinking winter might be loosening its grip early. Catherine had been married to Thomas for 4 months now, and their life had settled into a comfortable rhythm of shared responsibilities and growing intimacy. She had proven herself capable of managing the household, contributing to ranch operations, and maintaining the social connections that had become so important to their community. Emma had blossomed under Catherine's care, growing more confident and cheerful with each passing day. The little girl now called Catherine Mama, without any hesitation, and Catherine's heart swelled with love every time she heard it. She had found in Emma the daughter she had never expected to have, and in Thomas, she was discovering a husband who valued her for who she truly was, rather than who others expected her to be. But on the 3rd Tuesday of February, their peaceful existence was shattered by a crisis that would test everything Catherine had learned about frontier life and her own inner strength. The trouble began when Sarah Henderson arrived at their door in the middle of the afternoon, her face pale with worry and her horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Catherine," Sarah gasped as she dismounted, "thank God you're here. We need help, bad help. There's been an accident at the Morrison place and Doc Peterson is snowed in up at the Wilkins Ranch with old Bill's pneumonia. Alice Morrison is in labor, but something's wrong. The baby's coming early and she's bleeding more than she should." Catherine felt her stomach drop. Alice Morrison was barely 20 years old and expecting her first child. Her husband, Peter, was one of the younger ranchers in the area, and Catherine knew they had been looking forward to starting their family with all the joy and anxiety of young parents. "How early is the baby?" Catherine asked, already mentally preparing for what might be needed. "At least 6 weeks. Maybe more," Sarah replied grimly. "Peter rode over to get me because he knows I've helped with births before, but Catherine, I've never dealt with anything like this. Alice is in real trouble." Catherine had assisted with Ellen Garrett's delivery just a few months ago, but that had been a normal, full-term birth with an experienced mother. A premature baby with complications was far beyond anything she had ever handled. "Thomas!" she called, and her husband appeared from the barn where he had been working. "I need to go to the Morrison place. There's an emergency with Alice's baby." Thomas took one look at Sarah's expression and nodded grimly. "I'll hitch up the wagon. Emma can come with us or stay with Sarah." "I want to come," Emma said firmly. "Maybe I can help take care of Alice." Within 30 minutes, they were racing across the snow-covered prairie toward the Morrison Ranch. Catherine's mind was spinning with everything she could remember about difficult births from conversations with other women and from helping with Ellen's delivery. She had brought supplies, clean linens, her sewing kit for any stitching that might be needed, and the few medical supplies they kept at the ranch. The scene at the Morrison place was chaos. Peter met them at the door, his face ashen and his hands shaking. "Thank God you're here. She's in so much pain, and there's so much blood. I don't know what to do." Catherine followed Sarah into the bedroom while Thomas stayed with Peter and Emma, settled in the kitchen to prepare hot water and organize supplies. What Catherine saw there made her heart race with fear. Alice was indeed in serious trouble. The bleeding was severe, she was barely conscious, and the baby was clearly trying to come too early. "Alice," Catherine said gently, taking the young woman's hand. "It's Catherine McAllister. I'm here to help you." Alice's eyes fluttered open, unfocused with pain and exhaustion. "Mrs. McAllister, is my baby going to be okay?" Catherine felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. This young woman's life, and her baby's life, might depend on decisions Catherine would have to make with limited knowledge and experience. "We're going to do everything we can," Catherine said firmly, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Sarah and I are both here, and we're not going anywhere until you and your baby are safe." Over the next several hours, Catherine found herself drawing on reserves of strength and knowledge she hadn't known she possessed. The baby was indeed coming early, and the birth was complicated by Alice's excessive bleeding and the infant's small size. Catherine had to make difficult decisions about when to intervene and when to let nature take its course. At one point, when Alice's bleeding became life-threatening, Catherine had to perform procedures she had only heard described by other women. Her hands shook as she worked, but her voice remained calm and reassuring as she guided Alice through the crisis. The baby, when it finally arrived near dawn, was tiny and struggled to breathe on its own. Catherine worked frantically to clear the infant's airways and stimulate breathing, using techniques she had learned from watching the birth of calves and foals, but adapting them for a human child. "Is the baby?" Alice whispered weakly. "She's alive," Catherine said, wrapping the tiny girl in warm blankets. "She's very small, but she's breathing, and her heart is strong." The next 24 hours were touch and go for both mother and child. Catherine barely left Alice's side, monitoring her condition and helping to care for the premature baby who needed feeding every 2 hours and constant warmth to survive. Thomas proved invaluable during this crisis, managing the household, caring for Emma, and handling the ranch responsibilities that Peter couldn't manage while his wife and daughter fought for their lives. Emma showed remarkable maturity, helping with cooking and cleaning and even assisting Catherine with some of the baby's care. On the second day, when it became clear that Alice and the baby were going to survive, Peter broke down in tears of relief and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said to Catherine. "You saved their lives. Doc Peterson couldn't have done better." Catherine felt exhausted, but deeply satisfied. She had faced a life-or-death situation and found within herself the strength and knowledge to make the right decisions. More importantly, she had discovered that her instincts and compassion, combined with the practical skills she had learned over the past months, made her genuinely valuable to this community in ways she had never imagined. Word of Catherine's success in saving Alice and the baby spread quickly through the ranching community. She found herself being consulted on medical matters, asked for advice on childbirth and childcare, and regarded as someone who could be counted on in any emergency. But the real transformation was in Thomas's attitude toward their marriage. The practical arrangement he had envisioned had evolved into something much deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and genuine affection that had grown steadily over their months together. One evening in late March, as they sat on the porch watching Emma play with a new batch of kittens, Thomas surprised Catherine with a question she hadn't expected. "Do you ever think about having children of our own?" he asked quietly. Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. This was territory they had never discussed, though she had thought about it often in recent weeks. "I would love that," she said simply. "Emma is wonderful, and I couldn't love her more if she were my own blood. But yes, I would like to have children with you." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "I've been thinking about it too. This marriage started as a practical arrangement, but it's become something I never expected." Catherine looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When I married Mary, we were young and in love, but we didn't really know each other as partners. We learned together through trial and error. With you, it's been different. We've built something together from the beginning, based on respect and shared work and common goals." He turned to face her more directly. "What I'm trying to say is that I've fallen in love with who you are, not just the idea of having a wife, but you specifically. The woman who stayed with the Garretts for 3 weeks, who saved Alice Morrison's life, who makes Emma laugh every day, who's turned this house into a real home." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thomas, I love you too. I didn't expect it when I came here, but somewhere between learning to milk cows and hosting coffee gatherings and surviving blizzards with you, I realized that I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Thomas leaned over and kissed her, and this time it was nothing like the brief, ceremonial kiss they had shared at their wedding. This was the kiss of two people who had found in each other not just companionship, but true partnership and love. As spring began to bloom across the Wyoming prairie, Catherine looked back on the past year with amazement. She had come west as a desperate woman fleeing a scandal, hoping for nothing more than a fresh start and a chance to rebuild her life. Instead, she had found a home, a family, and a community where her strengths could flourish and her contributions were valued. The ranch had become more prosperous under her management of the household and social connections. Emma had grown into a confident, happy child who was thriving under Catherine's guidance, and Thomas had evolved from a lonely widower looking for practical help into a loving husband who valued Catherine's mind, respected her capabilities, and appreciated the joy she brought to their daily life. But perhaps most importantly, Catherine had discovered who she truly was when freed from the constraints of Eastern society's expectations. She was a woman who could face crisis with calm competence, who could build community through genuine caring, and who could create a home that was not just a place to live, but a center of warmth and welcome for everyone who entered it. The final test of Catherine's integration into frontier life came in May when a letter arrived from Philadelphia. Catherine's sister Margaret had written to inform her that their father had died and left Catherine a substantial inheritance, enough money to return to Philadelphia in comfort and re-establish herself in society if she chose. Catherine read the letter twice, then handed it to Thomas without comment. He read it carefully, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. "This changes things," he said finally. "How so?" Catherine asked. "You have choices now that you didn't have before. You could go back if you wanted to, live comfortably, find a different husband, have the life you were originally meant to have." Catherine looked at him with surprise. "Is that what you want me to do?" "Of course not," Thomas said quickly. "But I want you to stay because you choose to, not because you have no other options." Catherine smiled and moved closer to him on the porch swing. "Thomas McAllister, where exactly do you think I would rather be than right here, with you and Emma, in the home we've built together? But the inheritance can be invested to improve this ranch and provide for Emma's education," Catherine interrupted. "Or it can sit in a bank back east for all I care." "Thomas, don't you understand? This is my life now. You and Emma and this community are my family. I'm not the desperate woman who answered your advertisement anymore. I'm your wife, Emma's mother, and a member of this community. Why would I want to give that up to go back to being someone I never really wanted to be in the first place?" Thomas pulled her closer, and Catherine could see the relief and love in his eyes. "I hoped that's how you felt, but I needed to hear you say it." As summer settled over their ranch, Catherine found herself busier than ever. The inheritance had indeed been put to good use, improving the ranch facilities, establishing a small school for the community's children with Catherine as the teacher, and investing in breeding stock that would make their operation more profitable. Emma thrived in the small school, showing particular aptitude for reading and arithmetic. Catherine had also taken in 2 other children whose families lived too far from any other educational opportunities, creating a small but thriving learning environment that served the broader community. Thomas had grown increasingly confident in including Catherine in all aspects of ranch decision-making. Her insights into animal behavior, her connections with other ranching families, and her practical approach to problem-solving had proven invaluable in building their operation. But more than that, their marriage had deepened into the kind of partnership that made both of them stronger. They worked together, faced challenges together, and built their future together with the kind of mutual respect and love that created a solid foundation for whatever might come. One evening in late August, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset over the vast Wyoming landscape, Catherine reflected on how completely her life had transformed. "Do you remember what you wrote in that advertisement?" she asked Thomas. Thomas smiled. "Something about seeking a sensible woman for marriage. And instead you got someone who was definitely not sensible," Catherine said with a laugh. "No," Thomas replied, pulling her closer. "I got someone who was better than sensible. I got someone who brought light and joy and community spirit to places I didn't even know were dark. I got a woman who could face any challenge and find a way not just to survive it, but to make everyone around her stronger in the process." Catherine looked out over the ranch that had become her home, thinking of all the people who had become her family, not just Thomas and Emma, but the entire network of ranching families who now considered her one of their own. She thought of Alice Morrison's healthy baby, of Ellen Garrett's grateful smile, of Emma's laughter, and of the small school that was already changing the prospects for children throughout their corner of Wyoming territory. "I think," she said finally, "that what you actually found was a woman who needed this place as much as it needed her." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I think what I found was exactly what I needed, even though I was too stubborn to know it when I wrote that advertisement." As the stars began to appear in the vast prairie sky above them, Catherine McAllister looked at her life and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The sensible, practical marriage Thomas had wanted had evolved into something far more precious. A love story built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the kind of deep partnership that could weather any storm the frontier might bring. She had come west as a woman fleeing her past, and had found instead a future brighter than anything she could have imagined. In this vast, beautiful, challenging land, surrounded by people who valued her for who she truly was, Catherine had finally found home.